Welcome to Persona Interviews. I'm Rob Simmelcare. So this is a tricky time for so many families and parents in particular with what's going on with the coronavirus. We're all concerned, of course, that our health could end up in a compromised situation. If we end up in the hospital, who takes care of our kids, who makes important decisions about our children, and what happens if we don't have a will? How do we get a will in place during this chaotic time? Joining me to talk about all these issues is attorney Shannon McNulty. Shannon has a law practice in the New York City area, and she specializes in issues of trusts and estates, family law, and all the issues facing parents during a time like this. Shannon, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Shannon's on the Persona Interviews app under Shannon McNulty. You can find her there, send her your questions. She will answer your questions on the Persona Interviews app if they are not answered in this conversation. So Shannon, let's start with hospitalization. So many people being hospitalized still in the United States, day in and day out. If someone is hospitalized and ends up in a situation where they're incapacitated, not able to make medical decisions for themselves, what happens?
This is a question that I'm getting a lot recently. People are really concerned about this, seeing all of the hospitals even being overwhelmed, especially in New York City. And the answer to that really depends on what you have in place, whether you have a document authorizing someone to make medical decisions for you, or if you don't. If you do have that document, which is called a healthcare proxy, in some states it's called a medical power of attorney, then the person that you've authorized to make those decisions is going to make those decisions. If you haven't authorized someone through a legal document, then it will be, in most states, it's going to be like your next of kin. So it would be your spouse if you're married. If you're not married, your adult children, if you have them. If not, maybe your parents. So it is something you definitely want to think about, especially I would say if you're not married, or if you don't want your spouse making that decision. That's another thing as well. You want to just make sure that you have something in place indicating who you want to have make that decision, and then also what kind of decision do you want them to make. And that's another part of this equation. It's not just who is making that decision, but what kind of decision they're making. A lot of times I get the question, what is the difference between a healthcare proxy and a living will? And the difference is that a living will or advanced medical directive is generally a directive to the doctor that is binding and needs to be followed. And a healthcare proxy is someone who can make medical decisions for you, and they could make them based on their judgment. We in New York, legally, we don't actually enforce living wills. There's a number of states that do not. And the reason I think is because it's really hard to make decisions like this, literally life or death decisions, when you have no idea what the circumstances are going to be when that document is called into play. And so, usually what I do is I recommend that my clients, they do a healthcare proxy, and then they make general guidance for the healthcare proxy as to would they want life-sustaining measures if they were in a very severe, like terminal, their illness was, their death was imminent. But it is something that I would say, even if you do have those documents in place, you want to review them, because what does it say? Would you want, in this case, to be on a ventilator? And you may, in the abstract, say, I don't want to be on a ventilator. But when you have a situation like we have now, then, you would have a decent chance of recovering. Then the answer to that may be different. So that's something I would say to review, and more importantly, talk to the person who would be making that decision, and make sure that they know what decision you would want to make. And that would, I think, is the most important thing, especially because it's so hard for family members and loved ones to make that decision. So to the extent they have any guidance from you, it will be much easier on them.
Got it. And how does someone go about getting those documents in place, a healthcare proxy, or in the states that allow it, a living will, right now with courts closed? Is it something that you can put in place? Does a court have to be involved, or is it just really a document that you can sign and disseminate without a court's involvement?
It's just a document that you sign. It has to be witnessed by 2 people. I think that's in most states, definitely in New York. And it doesn't need a notary in most cases. So it is a document. I would say that's one of the documents that, if you don't have it in place, like you can go online and find the document from your state, and it's publicly available. And ideally you have a lawyer taking you through those, but if you can't afford a lawyer, or you don't, you're not in a position to consult with a lawyer at this point, then doing it on yourself and by yourself and getting 2 witnesses is fine. I guess I would also say there's a caveat to that, is that the witnesses can't be included in the document. They can't be interested. So that can be a little bit challenging right now, because we're all usually stuck inside and we're not interacting with anybody who we're not close with.
Can the witnessing be done online though, without having to be in person? Or does that depend?
It depends on the state. In
Okay.
New York, that previously wasn't the case. Now it is the case. That being said, there are strict requirements for how that must be done. It must be done by video conference. The document has to be printed, signed, ID has to be presented during the video conference. The document has to be scanned to the witness that same day. So I would say if you're doing it online, you definitely want to work with a lawyer to do that.
Okay, makes sense. Let's talk about children for a second. Parents who end up hospitalized, especially I think single parents would be most worried about this. You end up hospitalized. What happens in terms of who's taking care of your children? If there's no one that you've already sort of delegated to play that role, what does the legal system have to say about taking care of kids of parents who are hospitalized, hopefully temporarily?
Yeah, so if you're hospitalized, but you are still conscious, and that's what hopefully, that would be the majority of cases, that doesn't affect your ability to be a legal guardian. So you can but it is really important to make sure that you have a practical plan in place. Even if legally you're still the guardian, you obviously aren't really able to care for your kids if you're in the hospital. So you want to have a practical plan in place to make sure that they're cared for by someone. In New York State and in a lot of other states, we have what we call like temporary guardianship documents, and that allows someone to legally become the guardian if you are incapacitated. So if you were on a respirator, if you were sedated, then that person would be able to step in and take legal guardianship. And that can be really important, because if there is no legal guardian available or a parent, then children often can't receive medical care unless it's really life-threatening. So you want somebody who can authorize that care. They often can't enroll in school, so you need someone to be able to do that. And then worst case scenario, it's not as likely, but if there is no one there, the state can get involved and the child can go into child protective services, and worst case scenario, go into foster care. The courts have to be involved. So it is definitely something you want to plan for. And the document that right now is really important, I would say, is what we call a standby guardianship document. And that would allow someone to temporarily take custody of your kids if you were incapacitated. So that is something that's really important. And then also just thinking about, like I said, from a practical perspective, even sometimes I have clients who they have done all of these documents, but maybe it's grandparents that are the ones who are the temporary guardians named. And right now, that might not be a great idea, because if your kids are coming from a household where they've been exposed to the virus, then transferring them to grandparents who are elderly and maybe immune compromised is probably not a great idea. Yeah. So you want to make sure that there's someone maybe who is younger, who has been maybe in your circle, other people who may be stronger to fill that role than maybe elderly people.
Make a really good point, really important point, given the particular situation we all find ourselves in right now. Let's talk about wills. No one enjoys thinking about making a will. It's not a fun process, obviously, but it's necessary anytime. I think now a lot of people are thinking about it more, just based on what we're all going through. What are the particular issues or challenges around creating a will that are going on right now, given the shutdown and courts being, pretty much all on hiatus?
So to create a will, you don't need the court involved. So that the court's status, and we could talk about that, but that shouldn't affect creating a will.
Okay.
You can, and it varies by state. In this case, right now in New York, we are authorized to do will signings remotely. And previously, we were not able to do that. You would have to come into the office and have witnesses and notaries present and sign everything. So right now, it's possible to work with a lawyer, and I think in most states they have allowed this to do everything remotely online. So, just like you and I are talking, this is how we have the meetings with clients.
Okay. Got it. So it's all doable. Again, you need a lawyer to go through that process with you, to walk you through not just the content of your will, but also the particular process that is involved in doing it remotely.
Yes, the process, at least in New York, is not an easy process. So, and the will requirements are really strict. If they are not complied with to the T, then the court will not accept the will. So it is really important that the will signings be executed properly, that you have the witnesses, that you have the notaries.
What are the concerns you're hearing most from clients right now? I know this is an unusual time for a practice like yours. What are the top types of calls you're getting from people, and what are you generally telling folks with these concerns?
I would say, the healthcare issues is a big one. Who will take care of the kids? Also, one of the other things is, if courts are closed, then how is that affecting this whole process? And like I said, for the documents themselves, you don't need court involvement. However, God forbid if something happens to you and you pass away, or if you've lost a loved one, then you do need the courts involved, and that can be really challenging right now. Right now the courts in New York are only taking emergency petitions, and so in terms of inheriting money, if you're relying on that, or that's necessary, you need to access things. It's really difficult right now, and it could last. I'm not sure how long that this backlog is going to take. Even on a good day, sometimes courts are backed up, and you have to wait quite a long time to have them act. So one of the things that we're recommending more so these days is to do what we call a revocable living trust. And that's something that kind of it's a substitute for your will, basically. And instead of the assets going through the court and through your will, they go through the trust. And that's a private process. And it doesn't require court involvement. It can be a lot less expensive. And most importantly, it's just a lot easier for your loved ones. So that's something that we're looking at much more seriously than we were before. And a lot of the things that is interesting, some things that I have advised clients on over the years of things to think about. You might not be able to rely on the courts. People are far away. What happens in those cases? Those are things that at one point that were hypothetical are now a reality. So, so some of these things are coming into play that, we kind of always thought that that's an option, or that's a possibility, but now it's more of a reality. So a lot more people are doing revocable living trusts, so that, whatever is going on with the court, that's not going to affect them. Their family can have the access to that money immediately, which may be really important if mortgages need to be paid, rent needs to be paid, all kinds of expenses need to be paid. And if that money is tied up for quite a while, then that could pose really difficult problems.
So if someone has a will now but does not have a revocable living trust, that's something they could quickly do and convert their current arrangement into one of these trusts?
Yeah, it's not a very complicated. We would do a document, needs to be notarized, and then you just need to make sure. The tricky part of the living trust is making sure the assets get into the trust. And that's where a lot of times that falls short, especially people are doing it online or something, and then they just have a trust and they didn't do anything to make it really effective. So then it's just kind of a waste.
Got it. Anything else, Shannon? What are the other things that you think people really should be thinking about, other advice that you have as we all go through this crisis?
I would say that one, make sure that you have your legal documents in place. If you don't, then now is probably a good time to do them. And in most cases, you can do them right from your home, so you don't have to go out anywhere. And then two, if you do have them in place, now is a good time to review them and to review not just the documents, but also, and I think this is just as important, what is the practical implication of those documents and what is the plan? Because you can have a stack of legal documents if you don't understand what they say, and if you don't have maybe a practical plan in place, like I said, like with relying on grandparents for guardianship, then it can pose a problem. So you want to make sure that what you've previously put into place is still applicable. And then also just thinking in terms of a practical perspective, how things would play out. I guess one of the other issues that I didn't mention was if people who you're relying on are far away, then that could be a problem too, because if your guardian is one, there's all kinds of issues if you have a guardian out of the country. But right now, even if your guardian is across the country, then that can be a problem. People might not be able to just jump on a plane. So those are things that you want to think about in terms of like what actually would take place and how you could just make sure that that those things are taken care of.
Yeah, well, it's a complicated time, and I really appreciate you spending a few minutes talking to us about these issues that are facing families, facing parents, facing pretty much anyone who has assets they want to protect. Shannon McNulty, again, you can find her on the Persona Interviews app under Shannon McNulty. She'll answer your questions there. And your website, Shannon?
It's www.mcnulty-law.com.
Okay. Shannon, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Rob.